As Taliban rule returns to Afghanistan, who will recognize their takeover? Western powers were left stunned by the fall of Kabul, but will they now attempt to work with the group they fought against for 2 decades? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. There is a new reality on the ground in Afghanistan, and NATO must now decide how to deal with the Taliban. The last time the militant group ruled the country, they did so with brutality. Executions and beatings were common, while women's rights were non-existent. So when they were ousted, many Afghans celebrated. But while Washington was still withdrawing its troops, the militant group made a swift return to power. Now millions in the country are looking for a way out. Several Afghans were killed at Kabul airport as they desperately tried to escape. Germany's president has called it a shameful moment for the West. But his U.S. counterpart, Joe Biden, says he stands by his decision.
We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped. A force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. We could not provide them was the will to fight for that future.
Well, that was on Monday, but at a press conference in early July, Biden was asked if there were any parallels with the U.S. troop withdrawal from Vietnam. He replied, none whatsoever, zero.
The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
But on Sunday, we saw that exact thing, helicopters evacuating personnel from the U.S. Embassy over the skies of Kabul. The images were eerily similar to the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the chaotic evacuation of the U.S. Embassy as communist forces took over the South Vietnamese capital. The scenes were even more desperate at the Kabul airport on Monday, Afghans clawing over each other to cling to any aircraft leaving the country, further strengthening comparisons to those events more than 50 years ago. As a young U.S. Senator, Joe Biden voted for the policies that led to the U.S. retreat from Vietnam. Both campaigns ran for around 2 decades, cost billions of dollars, and arguably ended in failure with the loss of thousands of American lives. But unlike Vietnam, after the fall of Saigon, the U.S. has ordered 5,000 troops back into Afghanistan to help with ongoing evacuations. The question now is, will Western powers be able to find a unified approach to dealing with a government in Afghanistan run by the Taliban? The UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab is calling for a pragmatic approach, saying Britain and its allies must make the best of the situation. Well, here to discuss what that might look like is from Stuttgart, Germany, Emran Feroz. He is a freelance journalist and the founder of the Drone Memorial for civilian victims of drone strikes. In London, we have Elisabeth Braw. She is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist with Foreign Policy magazine. And from Ann Arbor, Michigan is Jeffrey Stacey, former senior advisor to the U.S. State Department and a security consultant whose clients include NATO and the World Bank. Thanks all so much for being with us. Jeffrey, if I can start with you, let's see if there's some potential here to reframe this, I'll put it that way, because yes, the United States provided most of the foreign forces in Afghanistan, but it was a NATO mission. Still, we'd been hearing very little from other nations involved, and now we have the German president actually saying that responsibility needs to be equally shared for the human tragedy in Afghanistan that we're seeing at present. So why has the United States been the sole deciding factor here? And could NATO and European counterparts have stepped up to avoid that tragedy?
They could have indeed. In fact, the US just put the rest of NATO allies in a very bad and unenviable position that they frankly resent. They're doing so quietly and diplomatically behind closed doors, but this is bound to break out into the open. You heard Angela Merkel refer to this, and she's quite right. In fact, they could have done more, should have done more, and now can do more. That includes especially Turkey's role that was supposed to relate to security at the airport that could usefully be applied outside the airport, where the Taliban are preventing folks getting to the airport, many of whom are on Taliban hit lists, and that is a major problem. Turkey is in a position to effectively persuade the Taliban that they need to be a little more flexible, and that could start also with other allies really talking in terms of if the Taliban does not start to be inclusive, stop the assassinations, get serious about talks, start to name ministers from other parties outside of the Taliban, then maybe the NATO troops that are there on the ground will stick around.
Okay, let me ask Elizabeth quickly. I mean, do you agree with Jeffrey there that Turkey, arguably, as the only Muslim majority NATO member, could wield considerable influence on how the Taliban might behave from here on out?
It probably could. The question is whether it will be asked by the Taliban to to do any such thing, because we have to remember that from now on, for NATO, for Turkey or any other NATO states to be of any use in Afghanistan, they have to at least be condoned by the Taliban, or otherwise we'll have a renewed conflict of the kind that we haven't seen in many years. But coming back to what Jeffrey said just a minute or so ago, there is, in fact, as he said, a lot of resentment among European allies of America, both within NATO and outside NATO, because we have to remember it wasn't just NATO member states, but a number of other countries as well who helped and who sent soldiers for 20 years. And there is resentment in those countries that they weren't consulted by America before decided to pull out, because an American pullout meant really in reality that these other countries had to pull out as well. And they had, I think, some of them had a better understanding of what would happen, but they weren't listened to.
Okay. Armand, let me just get your take on what you've heard just there. You know, there is resentment, both agreed, from NATO nations over what the U.S. has done. But do you think that NATO and the European nations involved should have really spoken up considerably more loudly before such dramatic steps were actually taken?
Yes, probably. I mean, instead of that, we just see the NATO states, including the Americans, actually whitewashing themselves and their own role during the 20-year-long war. Now blaming, the whole Afghan side for all the failure. Of course, the Afghan side was very problematic, but this was very obvious from the start, from the very beginning, when NATO forces and the Americans invaded Afghanistan. They allied with drug lords, warlords, corrupt politicians, some of the worst people imaginable. And it was obvious that these guys were not interested in building a proper democracy or, proper society within Afghanistan. But I think it's rather problematic that at the moment we just see Western officials blaming the Afghan side, because actually NATO forces conducted a lot of war crimes within Afghanistan. And this was also one of the reasons why many people in rural areas actually supported the Taliban. A lot of people warned that this day would come. A lot of Afghans warned that this day would come, but nobody wanted to listen, and now we have the mess.
Right. You know, it was interesting. We just heard NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg say, along the lines of President Joe Biden in the United States, that it was Afghan leadership that actually failed to stand up to the Taliban. Well, we are where we are now, and I'm wondering, Jeffrey, Stacey, if there is a risk, because now we're hearing from the UK in particular, who the foreign minister is saying that ordinarily we wouldn't deal with the Taliban, but we need to be pragmatic. First of all, what does pragmatic actually mean? And is there a risk of stepping into, if I could phrase it this way, appeasement territory in order to kind of keep the Taliban calm? Go ahead.
Yes, I think we're hearing it already in this interview. The most war crimes were committed by the Taliban themselves. Let's be very, very crystal clear about that. Going forward, we have to realize that the Taliban were as shocked as anyone to be in Kabul faster than the 3 weeks they'd planned on. There is a lot of room for the international community and NATO in particular, Turkey, probably more than most, because it's trusted by all sides to influence them in this initial phase. This is critical. We have to lock in the supposed reforms of the Taliban. Are they going to be sure to keep the journalists working, the diplomats paid, the city services working across the country? And that is highly doubtful. They have committed the war crimes. They are responsible, and we should not worry in this initial phase. They fear NATO troops on the ground. They're worried about this beachhead. That is leverage, that is influence, and it should be used.
Okay. Elizabeth, I'm going to step a little further now because we also have in the equation Russia, China, and Pakistan all, making relatively positive statements toward the Taliban in recent days, indicating that they're willing to talk because the Taliban has sent the right signals. Should Europe and NATO be making that same kind of minimal effort, or should they actually only engage once, human rights standards are met and guaranteed somehow? I don't know how they would actually enforce that and monitor that on the ground, but at least some level of promise that there will be respect for basic human rights.
Well, I think that the fundamental flaw in the negotiation strategy of the Trump administration was to give the Taliban concessions in exchange for nothing, not even promises. And I think it would be foolish to continue that strategy. If we want the Taliban to behave in a certain manner, at least we should promise them something in exchange for engaging in the behavior that we wish to see. China and Russia have not made any such conditions on the Taliban. They've essentially both endorsed this new regime, and China quite enthusiastically. So, but we have to remember that China's only condition for dealing with foreign governments seems to be whether those governments criticize China's actions in Xinjiang region or not. It wasn't a great surprise that China recognized the Taliban. So what we can do is, the Taliban still need the West for trade. It can trade to a very large extent with China, but there will be some areas where it still needs the West. So while while the Taliban government may not be interested, or may not want to listen to the West, at least we have that one tool, which is the exchange of goods and services, where they will continue, their country will continue to rely on our countries.
Emran, do you agree there? I mean, tell us more about what you might see as the potential means to ensure that the Taliban adheres to whatever promises they've made, especially regarding human rights, because the military leverage has obviously been lost. But as Elisabeth's saying, there is the leverage of trade and also potentially foreign aid. We saw $12 billion pledged to Afghanistan back in November before the Taliban takeover. Are those going to have to be the tools to keep the Taliban in line and try to engage with that government going forward?
Yes, definitely. But before I focus on this one, I just want to answer on what has been said regarding the Taliban war crimes. This is not about denying Taliban war crimes, which are rather known and undisputable. But during the last 20 years, Afghanistan has been drone bombed. It was the most drone bombed country on the world. A lot of civilians have been killed. A lot of these crimes haven't been covered until today. And I think if this war on terror would have been successful, who are we talking to today? Who are these people? Who are the Taliban leaders? Most of them are alive. Most of them were successful with their missions. Afghan civilians suffered. The war on terror was a total failure. And I think that it is crucial to question any additional NATO military engagement in the country because it has failed during the last 20 years. Regarding your question, of course, I think there needs to be pressure on the Taliban regarding the things you mentioned. The Taliban know that they are dependent on foreign aid. The Afghan state cannot survive without foreign money. So this is a very, very crucial thing to focus on. I also want to add that in these days, because a lot of interviews, in these days, people ask me about did the Taliban change? How could we put influence on them? I think we should be really, really careful about that and focus, not just focus on the situation in Kabul. We just had the second day of the revived Islamic Emirate of the Taliban in Kabul, but we should also focus on what the Taliban are doing in other areas of Afghanistan, how their rule is taking place over there. Please let's not make the same mistake that has been done during the last 20 years, even at least during the last 40 years. Much focus of Western media coverage was just on Kabul, on the capital of Afghanistan, but the majority of people are not living there. And we still have to focus on other areas too. And now all of them are controlled by the Taliban. So that's important, I think.
Okay, Jeffrey, Stacey, go ahead.
Well, that's patently false. We need to discard a lot of these old assumptions and talk about what's happening on the ground. I've been there, I've served there, I've continued to be a lead UN consultant there in recent years. It's patently false that NATO has failed across the board. We need to talk about reality. The clear reality is that coming out of the Trump administration, you had a situation where even with a fairly minimal US footprint and then a larger NATO one with primarily European allies there doing training missions, there was an opportunity and a willingness from all militaries and NATO to keep the pressure on the Taliban, as it were, to take the gloves off. You do not attempt negotiations, as has recently been the case, with your hands held behind your back. Do so by pressing the foe on the battlefield and then working the diplomacy afterwards. NATO, primarily the US, and successive administrations have gotten that wrong. It's not true that the Taliban are a fearsome military force. They are a bunch of terrorists. And effectively, we had them right where we wanted them, and we let them off and essentially started handing them leverage, Khalilzad in particular, for Pompeo and Trump, and then more recently, by the mistake of keeping him in power, he continued to give leverage. And then you had Russia and China and Pakistan in particular. Let's talk about the reality of this. What changed? What allowed the Taliban to go on a lightning strike in the matter of a week? It was the foreign fighters coming across from two camps across the border in the Northwest Territories of Pakistan. Second, the ISI, supported by Russia and China, did deals up and down the country, buying off both senior Afghan commanders and governors in every province. They didn't take these districts and provinces by force. They were handed the keys to them. Let's talk about brass tacks. Let's talk about reality. Let's stop hissing into the wind about things we wish were going on, and let's get serious as an international community while we have a chance in this interim phase before the Taliban really start to act like themselves.
There's so much complexity here, and we're discussing a lot about what actually led to where we are today. But now the bottom line is we are exactly where we are. And Elisabeth, I want to bring you back into this because as we must agree now, the military leverage has been all but lost. So you're saying that trade has to be one of the tools that can be used to engage and include the Taliban, but I really do wonder if the Taliban cares. We have seen so many true pariah states now on this planet. You look at nations like North Korea, for example, who seems to need no one and is perfectly willing to go forward as a complete outcast, to put it mildly, on this planet. Why would the Taliban not feel the same? Why do they need anybody? Why are you convinced that trade and aid can be used as leverage of sorts going forward?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned North Korea. Even in North Korea, the members of the elite want to use, and not just want, they do use the sort of consumer products that we have here in the West because it's a very enjoyable life that we have here. Yes, they deny it to the rest of the population, but they want it for themselves, and that includes smartphones. And if we look at the sort of cars that the Taliban drive around, the cars they most prefer are Western cars. And as we all know, during 20 years, both they and the rest of the Afghan population have become somewhat acquainted with Western consumer goods. You can't just take that away without, well, I don't think they want to take all of that away for themselves. And I would assume, in fact, I will predict that this young generation has grown up knowing a bit about the sort of lifestyle that they've had as opposed to what their parents had. They would, I think, would be very unhappy if that were to be taken away from them,
Sure,
which
but
means that these goods have to come into the country.
yeah, but I mean, as Emran was alluding to, you know, there are so many criminal gangs and mafias also at work in Afghanistan. They can easily, using the drug trade, for example, find the money to bring in whatever products they feel there might be a market for that they can also profit from. So again, Emran, let me ask you, I mean, why would the Taliban fall in line with any international order? Right now, they're saying they're interested in doing so. They want to engage the world. The majority, though, out there does not trust that their intentions are that sincere. So, Emran, do you feel that your counterparts on the ground in Afghanistan, young people like yourself, are going to fall victim to just the chaos that is a lot of the corruption and criminality that exists in Afghanistan, and no matter what NATO and the U.S. tries to do?
Yes, I mean, of course, there is more than enough reason to not trust the Taliban regarding young people in the country. I mean, I've also been on the ground. I think I have been more on the ground than many Western analysts who were behind walls and with all different kinds of security. I've regularly reported from Taliban-controlled areas and also from other parts of the country. So with much respect, but this doesn't count as an argument when someone else tells me I have been on the ground. So, and I'm also in this very moment in touch with very many different people, especially in Kabul, young people. Until yesterday night, a lot of them, or until today morning, a lot of them had fear and didn't want to leave the house because they didn't know what to do. Many women, young girls, and of course, other human rights activists, journalists, people from this area, from these fields, they are feared. They don't know what to expect. But let's be very fair on this. They also don't hope for any international engagement anymore. Yesterday, we saw some of the most gruesome scenes of the last 20 years when Afghan refugees, or Afghans who tried to be refugees, to be more precise, wanted to leave the country and stormed the airport. And what did American troops there? American troops shot people at the Kabul airport. And I even heard that Afghan Americans, Afghans who had an American passport, American citizens, were not allowed to enter some of the planes because of racial profiling, because American soldiers were like, hey, you're an Afghan, you're not a white American, so, you know, piss off.
Okay.
Sorry to say that. These are the things that happened. And of course, many people are very frustrated about that.
Okay. Jeffrey, Stacey, you know, we've just heard the Taliban, though, actually promising now this amnesty that they're issuing on the ground, and they're also urging women to join the government. And I guess that brings us back to the question: is from now on, who will actually be able to oversee and enforce, monitor whatever guarantees the Taliban is making? Is it on the shoulders of NATO and the EU, because they are supposed to be, in a sense, the global human rights standard, let's put it that way, to look at Afghanistan and make sure that if that country is going to be engaged, that they do have to keep to these promises?
That's correct. And rumors and anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism aside, your question is very important. Where does the influence and the leverage stem from, and how should it be used now? What I suggest happens is that the UN, on the one hand, Turkey and Qatar on the other hand, form an international stakeholder relationship with the Taliban, with the West, slightly because of their lost influence at the moment, aside from the beachhead of the troops on the ground at the airport in particular, and that begin to work with Hamid Karzai and Abdullah. And essentially, right now, what those two gentlemen are doing is asking the Taliban, please, you know, keep girls in school, etc. And what we start to do is work the leverage as the Taliban begin to act like themselves again, locking in every reform that is possible in the interim. And what happens with the US administration losing so much political clout and a big dent to its international reputation, it is going to be in the mood quietly to begin to exert the influence of the troops right on the ground there at the airport. Turkey is in a impeccably good role to begin to wield this influence. If we start to coordinate this with Jens Stoltenberg, NATO, this will also allow the other European countries to step forward. Even the Czechs have essentially
Okay.
planes and troops on the ground. So let's get pragmatic. Let's discard old assumptions. Let's influence the Taliban in this initial phase while we can do so effectively for the sake of young and old Afghans, especially at home, but even across the world who like to
Okay.
go home to a peaceful democratic country one day.
Okay. Jeffrey, Stacey, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers. Let us know what you think. Looking forward to your comments, and we'll see you next time.